struggling with access to health services and health equity, and is still a challenging reality. So what's wrong with health aids and its actors, structures, paradigm and policies, method and processes? So how can the failures and the shortcoming of aid be addressed? How do we achieve real cooperation and solidarity within the beyond aid? So in October and November 2019, the Kampala Initiative was launched with a series of 4 public webinars, each focused on case that illustrates challenges in aid with a focus on possible solutions to advance solidarity and cooperation. The conversation on this topic was continued in a civil society workshop in Kampala in mid-November. And in 2020, the series of webinars will be continued. So you can see our announcement of a webinar documentation on our website. And also you can also start thinking about what case would you like to see featured in next webinar, and how you can do this with us, and also join the Kampala Initiative. We will come back on it by the end of this webinar. So the project of the National Advocacy Fund Civil Society Perspective on an enticing proposal. So I'm welcoming you all again for this webinar. And why are we having this webinar? National level health advocacy play a vital role in our struggles to achieve health for all. And yet there is an alarming lack of funding for this work. So we know we need more funding and resources, but the question is, how should we go about securing this? And how do we avoid creating a old funding practices that prioritize donor voices over those of communities and civil society as a new model emerge? In recent months, a number of initiatives have arisen that aim to address this question. For the next Kampala Initiative webinar, which is the one that we are convened for now, we are proposing to explore on this initiative. So the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership, a coalition working to develop a new funding mechanism for civil society advocacy for health. So the project is hosted by Joep Lange Institute, and for that we are welcoming the 2 speakers from the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership, which are from the steering committee, as well as the 2 speakers who will share their reflection on this initiative from their own experience as recipients or critical reflector on health funding models. So there will be also plenty of time for discussion. So the reflections shared in this webinar will be fed back to the National Advocacy Funding Partnership Steering Committee as they develop the plan. So the format of this webinar is, we are very lucky to have 4 brilliant speakers with us today. We have Alain Malache and Angela NGUKU, who are part of the team exploring the idea of a National Health Advocacy Fund. And then we will have a shorter QA session in case there are clarifying question on the National Health Advocacy Fund Partnership. So please use the QA function for this. So we are very pleased to have you on board, Mr. Alain Malache and Angela NGUKU. We have also DEIRDRE BURCA from FORUS network. I'll leave the floor to I will leave the floor to Ravi that, to introduce the two remaining speakers, as we are two co-facilitators of this webinar.
Thank you, Spero. So after Alan and Angela have had a chance to speak, we'll be hearing from DEIRDRE de BURCA from FORUS. She'll be talking about her organization's experiences with funding for national level advocacy. And then from KENNETH MWEHONGE, he works with HEPS in Uganda, and he'll also be speaking about national level advocacy funding and their own experiences. Let's move ahead directly. So Spero, back to you, and we'll then hear from the first speakers.
Yeah, so thank you, Ravi, for this. We are very excited to pass over to the first speakers of this webinar, who is Mr. Alan Malashe. He's from KENNETH. Alan Malashe is I'm going to introduce him very shortly, but before I will hand over to him the floor. So Alan Malashe is the founding executive director of Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS, KENNETH, and has over a decade of experience in promoting ethical human rights-based approaches to health planning, programming, and service delivery. So, Mr. Alan Malashe, we will have a short of 10 minutes for QA once you finish. So please do post any question into your QA box as they speak. So, Mr. Alan Malashe, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you for all the panelists and attendees who are here. Sepro, Hector, I appreciate your introduction of the session, and Ravi for having us on board. I will be sharing this session both with my colleague Angela NGUKU, and so I'll take about 7 minutes, and she'll take another 7 minutes. I'll largely talk about the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership, why it was convened, what we are thinking through, and what we want to do to take it forward. And Angela will focus more around what are the values and principles that guide us, and we look forward to having an interaction with everyone to strengthen this idea, to be challenged about it, and to also get feedback, move it through. So I want to begin by explaining that the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership is a coalition of national, regional, and global level health advocacy organizations and networks that are working to secure adequate and sustainable resources to advocate at country levels for comprehensive, high quality, and equitable healthcare for all. We are all aware on this call that advocacy by civil society is a very essential component and has been an essential component of global health over the past 20 years. We've got great examples from the HIV world, from the TB world, from the malaria world, from the sexual and reproductive health and disability rights and mental health world, around how civil society have played a critical role in terms of shaping the health sector. And in the current situation we are in, the emergence of COVID-19 has also only served to heighten the importance of civil society advocates, especially at the national level, for high quality, rights-based, sustainable healthcare for all. So that's the context in which the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership was thought out. As I said, it's a growing partnership of organizations from different regions. And we took cognizance of the fact that despite that it's proven about the impact of health advocacy and the fact that health advocacy at the national level is critically important, this area has consistently been underfunded, and particularly resources have not been reaching to those at the grassroots level. And so sometimes some of the resources needed are resources to hold governments accountable. So sometimes it's difficult for these resources to come from domestic governments. For instance, the Kenyan government is unlikely to fund KENNETH for KENNETH to hold it accountable for human rights violations. So that's the challenge that we saw coming up. And so going forward, we thought through what kind of funding stream could be created to be able to reach grassroots organizations, to be able to help build coalitions across the health sector, to be able to build campaigns that can drive and advance the right to health care, and that such funding would be able to ensure that we see governments being held accountable, we advocate for increased domestic resource, and human rights are protected within the health system. And so that's the thinking behind the National Health Advocacy. And in developing that mechanism, we've thought through a number of principles around which some are similar to the Kampala Initiative. We're thinking through around principles that ensure we're not working in silos. We're thinking about principles that ensure that the funding is additive and not extractive or taking away from what you're already doing. We're looking at the fact that the funding should look at the priority sets by the national organizations and the grassroots organizations, so that it's not something that is dictated, but it's something that feeds into what applies for the people around. And then also the joint learning, the sharing of information is also an important bit that we're thinking through. Currently, we are sharing this process with a colleague from the Dutch government, Maya Esvaled, who is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have a steering committee for civil society. So far, we have had one physical meeting in February. And out of the physical meeting, we created a steering committee that has helped come up with an investment case. We also have opened this up to other broader civil society beyond the sectors that we work in. And the next steps for us are to initiate a conversation with donors around this particular partnership, to be able to see, do donors have the appetite for this? And if they do have the appetite, then we can move to the third level of having a joint meeting between the civil society partners and the donors to be able to agree what would be the way forward. So we have made quite some advances in terms of trying to get people together to brainstorm through issues. And now eventually the most important step remains having a donor meeting, and then eventually having a joint meeting between the donors and civil society representatives to further explore what this initiative should look like. I just want to conclude by saying that this initiative is not decided. It's still a process of conceptualizing. It's still a process of discussion. And we welcome all thoughts and opinions around this. I will turn it back to allow Angela to go through some of the principles and thoughts that we came up when we last met in Netherlands to think about this initiative. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alan Malache, for this very, very comprehensive presentation that you did. And now we will hand over to Angela to tell us more about this idea that Mr. Alan Malache has tried to give some guidelines to. So Mrs. Angela NGUKU is from White Ribbon Alliance, National Health Advocacy Fund Partnership Steering Committee 2. Mrs. Angela NGUKU is the founder and executive director of the White Ribbon Alliance in Kenya, a people-led movement for reproductive, maternal, and newborn health and rights. She doubles as African advisor for the White Ribbon Alliance Global. So I'm going to remind you that we have also 10 minutes for the Q&A. So once Mrs. Angela has presented, please do post any question in the Q&A box. So Mrs. Angela, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Alan, for that for the intro to the funding mechanism of partnership. I will talk about the guiding principles and why we think this mechanism is really important at this point in time, and some of the guiding principles that are guiding it. Having worked in the global health for the last 16 years, and working in the space of health, I think that I've noted, and that's why I really am interested in joining this, being part of this partnership, is because advocacy, and especially at the national level, has been seen more of an afterthought. It has never been on the mainstream. Yet we keep on talking about empowering communities, resilient communities that are going to ensure that there's sustainability and that they can voice out their issues at the government, at the national level, so that governments can be able to respond to the needs of communities. But over and over again, funding has never really been given for national level advocacy. And where it's given, it actually trickles, and it's never a priority at the end of the day. It's always like an afterthought. It's never really part of the whole place. Yes, we know that the voices of communities, and when communities lead, then there's more impact, because they form 80% of the stakeholders that we have at the table when deciding on programs and the guiding principles Alan has really talked about. But I need to mention some of the key things that we are looking at, and when we discuss, and we've been discussing since February today, we are looking at a funding process that is sustainable, with priorities that are set by affected communities. A lot of times you'll agree with me that many of the priorities, many of the funding priorities actually trickle down from the global level downwards, or from the national level downwards. It's never about from the communities upwards. And so this is a mechanism that is looking at communities, or the people who are affected by the health issues are the ones deciding or determining what are the priorities that need to be funded at the end of the day. So this is a partnership that is looking at building, that is built on total trust and high levels of accountability. Being in the sector for that long, I'm sure you'll also agree with me that there has been that lacking accountability or trust in terms of, yes, the money has come in, but where has the money gone to? Over and over again, I keep on questioning my spaces that I've seen donors and I've seen funders coming in and still funding leaking buckets, where money has been given out to do work that is health related, but there's misappropriation of those funds. Community voices are not heard. They're speaking, but there's no funding to support them to actually say, no, stop it. We have already not even been able to do ABCD. So more money is given, leaving out the key players. So the right to health should be the overall driver of any funding mechanism and of the partnership, that is the associated partnership. So at the end of the day, it's about human rights. It's about funding, not for the sake of funding, but funding, the benchmark should be the right to health. Should be the driver for any mechanism, any funding mechanism for advocacy at the national level. Two, it should focus, the main focus should be around elevating the voices of the grassroots, with the vast majority of the resources spent at country levels. Well, I've talked about the 16 years that are spent at country levels, and where they're spent at country levels are spent on groups that are working to actually elevate the voices of communities to advance their health at the end of the day. This partnership is also looking at the principle of all funding activities should demonstrate impact. I am sure you'll also agree with me that a lot of times there's funding that, even when there's no demonstrable impact, even when there's duplication of efforts, there's siloing of efforts, and at the end of the day, I've seen a lot of segmentation of the same people that we are supposed to be. So there's a siloing approaches in terms of how are we addressing the same issue, yet it's the same person at the end of the day. So this should be demonstrable, not just impact, but also sustainability, sustainable impact that is driven by grassroots at the end of the day. And the overall principle of accountability should apply to how civil society groups and their representatives hold themselves accountable at national levels to the communities they work in and for. A lot of times we talk about accountability only at the national level, but the accountability also of the CSOs and NGOs and NGOs has been lacking a lot of times. So this funding is looking at ensuring that they start accountability also at the CSOs to the communities that they serve, because they also need, and communities need to have that voice and space to be able to actually hold these CSOs to account at the end of the day. Then the other aspect of the other principle is about the globalness, and equal access are very critical for us. So we are looking at we've heard over time that money is going to the global south, leaving out some of the areas that are eligible. They have not been funded before, because they belong maybe to some areas that are considered not needy. So this is looking at eligibility for funding, and application ability should not be based on country income classification. We are looking at ensuring that equal opportunity for CBOs and CSOs in regions that are often now excluded in many donor policies. For example, Latin America, we know that has happened, Eastern Europe and parts of Southern Asia. So we are looking at eligibility in terms of where we have equal access. We have seen places where people are still being, there's still marginalization but they are classified out of the fund, the mainstream funding at the end of the day. I think I talked about human rights. Human rights lie at the core of all funded activities and programs for this mechanism. We are looking at reaching difficult places and difficult people, finding ways to get funding to and in support of advocates in dangerous situations and doing dangerous work. That has been, there has been exclusions in some of the funding that has been coming in the past. So this funding partnership is looking at ensuring that that is actually inclusive. Institutional strengthening is very key, ensuring that those doing advocacy work at national and subnational levels have the capacities needed. I'm speaking to this working in a national level organization where you are given a small amount of money to do advocacy work, but strengthening you to be able to build that voice and that movement to actually grow as never missing out in most of the funding that is coming in for advocacy. We are looking at this funding mechanism, this fund and building the capacity of institutions, organizations that are actually working to strengthen. And at the end of the day, we get more voices, and those voices are empowered enough to be able to empower even the communities. New money, not repurposed money. So it's not by the way, it's not an afterthought at the end of the day. And we're looking at social determinants and structural drivers of health, acknowledging the direct and profound impact of poverty, substandard housing, limited access to education and cultural and social constraints, as well as other relevant determinants could help to strengthen the fund's overall objective of improving health outcomes for all. So we really think and believe in this fund that we are looking to set up at the end of the day. So thank you so much for the opportunity for us to be able to share this. We welcome any of your observations or some of the comments that we think we need to do to strengthen what we are hoping to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, NGUKU, and thanks for citing the different principles that are governing your initiative with Joep Lange Institute, and we can keep in mind that we need that bottom-up approach that is very relevant for grassroots population to be very associated to those kind of initiative, and also the notion of accountability, which is very, very important. I would like also to call on people who are with us to that if they have some clarifying questions for the National Health Advocacy Program Fund Partnership, to share the question in the QA box, because we will use them so that we will also use them to respond to them shortly. So I will hand over to Ravi, who is with my co-facilitator in this presentation of webinar. I'll hand over to Ravi to introduce now Mrs. DEIRDRE de BURCA, and Ravi, over to you now.
Great, thank you, Spero. We have right now 3 questions that have already appeared in the Q&A box. We're taking a few moments right now, as Spero mentioned earlier, just to get some clarifications about the National Health Advocacy Fund. It's so that it's clear to everybody, it's a concept that's under development. So this is our chance to interrogate an idea and help this process move along so that it represents a different model for health aid. Let's turn first to Antonia Tukundane. She's asked, I'll read out the question and then I'd be happy to hear from her. But it's thanks to Alan for preparing the presentation. You've spoken about a rights-based service. How will the National Health Advocacy Fund partnership help grassroots healthcare providers have opportunities to get funding, especially when the services they provide is not part of the government priorities? As an example, palliative care services in Uganda struggle to get donors to support them. Palliative care is a human right, and so is being pain-free. Alan, let's take that one straight first.
Thank you very much, Antonia, for the question. And just as to clarify, as Ravi said, the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership is just a partnership. It's not a fund that has been set. And as I said, one of the key goals around that particular National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership is that it's geared towards supporting advocacy that can help in ensuring there's increased funding for domestic health money. There's increased funding for grassroots organizations. The thinking that we currently have around the National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership is to support work that does advocacy and not more of service delivery, because we tend to feel a number of donors support more of service delivery work and less of advocacy work. And so in terms of palliative care being an important issue, what would envision is that this particular National Health Advocacy Funding Partnership would be able to get money down to the grassroots organizations that are able to advocate and hold the local governments, push the local governments to make budgetary increase that sees more funding going towards palliative care, but also empowering local advocates to be able to push for the issues that need to be priority, including palliative care at that particular level. Happy to expound more if it's not clear, but that is sort of the long and short of the response I could give for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. That's very clear. A quick follow-up from Antonia. She's wondering, there are 2 points. How will the National Health Advocacy Fund elevate voices at the grassroots? And secondly, what's the role for capacity building for grassroots organizations in advocacy, demonstrating their impact and ensuring sustainability?
Ravi, would you like me to handle that, or Angela?
It's good. It's directed to you, but I'd like to hear from Angela as well. So let's start with you, Ellen.
Great. So the National Health Advocacy Fund partnerships are the model that we're looking at, seeks to ensure that, one, resources are taken down to the grassroots level. And by resources, we're not only looking at financial resources, we're also looking at capacity and technical assistance to be able to ensure people are able out to carry out the advocacy that we need. We didn't have time to mention it, but we're developing a document that captures, and we welcome people to email my colleague David Barr, whose contacts will provide, that captures some of the successful activities that have been done that would be showcased. So in short, my answer would quickly be that indeed, by trying to get resources to grassroots organizations, and those resources would include elements that allow for capacity building to improve on the advocacy skills, to improve on the reach of the advocacy topics, to improve on the reach of the advocacy areas, that would help in terms of leaving community-based or grassroots organizations in a better place to negotiate with donors, in a better place to carry forward their activities, and hopefully have a platform where they can fairly compete for resources that relate to the national level. I'll stop there and maybe I'll ask Angela to build up on that.
Thanks, Ellen. Angela, can you add to this point?
I think in one of the guiding principles that we have is about institutional strengthening and of course strengthening the voices and the communities basically. And we realize that working with in the space at national level, there are many community-based organizations or CSOs at community levels that have what it takes to be able to be where they ought to be and to hold their governments to account and advocate on their issues, but they do not have the power and the voice because they have no resources. So basically, this fund is about strengthening such institutions and they can be able actually to speak up. So I think basically that's what Alan has spoken about. Yeah. In terms of sustainability, we're looking at if we are building individual organizations, community grassroots-led organizations, we are looking at if that capacity build, it's something that is going to be rolled out and growing the organization, even growing not just from one region to another region. So we are looking at them being able to reach a point where they are sustainable enough to be able to carry their issues without having to seek for constant funding from outside. Over to you, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Angela. That's great. We've got quite a few questions, but we do need to move on. What I'm going to do is just highlight those questions from Obota, Nigeria, about accountability for those who are receiving the funding, holding the CSOs accountable, and getting communities involved. Similarly, around accountability, Peter Owiti has asked about how UHC can be incorporated into accountability. Mansur Suleiman has asked about advocacy for health financing and what's worked. I'd like to reserve those comments and questions for our discussion later on. Miria Kutsumpa has asked a specific clarification question about who are the donors that have been approached so far for the National Health Advocacy Fund. And perhaps we can hear from you, Angela, and from Alan. And with that, we'll close the question and answer for clarifications and hold the other points for the discussion later. So Alan, Angela, anything about the donors that have been approached?
Yes, Ravi, I think we can say that we have a subcommittee that helps with resource mobilization, and we have identified a list of many potential donors. We have sent out letters to them, but we would want at least to clarify the one donor that is on board on this conversation is the Dutch government, and hence the co-chairship of Maya, who comes from the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And we all know the Dutch government has a number of initiatives that seek to support grassroots organizations. We're ever thinking of funders, including the Global Fund. We are thinking about a number of funders in the healthcare sector. And once these funders who we have sent for letters receive and agree to be part of the conversation, we'll then be able to make a list available around who we've been able to contact. But for now, we have just done a long list, and the ones who are already on board for the conversation is the Dutch government. The rest, we're in the process of approaching them, starting largely the last week of August, because many are out on summer vacation, and so we hope to actively reach out to them. But we have worked with a resource mobilization committee that has been helping us to move that forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Angela, anything to add?
Ravi, I don't have anything else to add.
Okay, great. So with that, thanks for those clarifications. Very good comments coming up, both in the chat box and the questions and answer. We'll now move to DEIRDRE. She is the advocacy coordinator for FORUS. FORUS is a global civil society network with a membership of over 69 national development platforms and 7 regional coalitions. DEIRDRE is also currently a member of the steering group for the SDG Watch in Europe, which is a cross-section of civil society that is focused on supporting and monitoring implementation of Agenda 2030 among the EU and its member states. She also previously worked with World Vision at its EU office in Brussels as the Director of Advocacy. So DEIRDRE, if you can take us through your points about how your perspective on national level advocacy.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction, and hello everybody. My name is DEIRDRE de BURCA, and I'm going to talk to you today about a report, a study into the future funding of civil society that was commissioned by the Global Civil Society Organization for which I work. So next slide, please. So this research was commissioned in 2019, and it really looked at current funding sources and modalities for civil society organizations. And its focus was really, I mean, obviously civil society is very broad in scope. So we looked at civil society networks and platforms at national and regional level, and the kind of funding sources and modalities that are available to them, particularly in the areas of capacity development and advocacy, because these are 2 areas that our network focuses on. And we looked at really investigating the strengths and the weaknesses of different CSO funding sources and modalities, and making recommendations, importantly, about more effective future resourcing of CSO networks and platforms. So our methodology was very straightforward. The research was carried out by a research team that were external to FORUS. They were consultants who were active in CSO networks and had a background in institutional funding for development. And the research was conducted between February and June 2019. So a comprehensive literature review of studies into different current funding sources and modalities for CSOs was carried out, and this was combined with field research. So the field research involved an online survey for all our members, followed by in-depth online interviews of selected FORUS members in different parts of the world, also partner organisations and relevant think tanks and experts. Next slide, please. So the research findings. So one of our key findings was that members' fees are a source of income for many FORUS members, but they're a significant source of income for only a small number of them. Another key finding was that there is an alarming lack of diversity in the sources of funding for the majority of platforms and networks who are interviewed. So many rely largely or exclusively on EU funding, and that was particularly true of smaller national CSO platforms that were based in the Global South. So many of the platforms who were interviewed complained of having to rely for financial support on short-term project-based funding. This was project funding that was on a 2 to 3 year cycle. And this meant that the financial situation of many CSOs was precarious and experienced by them as precarious and discouraged long-term organizational and strategic planning. Another finding was that closing civic space, which is a growing trend, that this affects the ability of CSOs to strategize for their own sustainability, including financial sustainability, as well as to innovate and to act free from undue government interference. Other findings were that there's a marked lack of research into civil society funding from the perspective of civil society itself, that a lot of the literature on CSO funding originates in the Global North and with a distinct lack of voices from the Global South. Another finding was that most funding sources currently available to CSOs are donor-controlled and managed, whether that's governments, international institutions or other donors. And the best practices that were identified through the study in financing of civil society have a power shift at their core. They place some decision-making in the hands of local communities and representatives of local civil society, for example, through grant-making that's participatory and co-created. And another finding was that most current funding sources and modalities for CSOs are not sensitive enough to local contexts or realities, and they do not capitalise enough on local grassroots knowledge and experience. Next slide, please. So what were the recommendations of our study? Well, the key recommendations were firstly that further research needs to be carried out into CSO funding that fully captures the perspectives of CSOs at the end of the funding chain. And this would help donors to fully understand what best practice could look like. Secondly, donors should involve CSOs in the co-creation of funding programs and modalities from the very start. Donors should proactively include smaller local organisations with local knowledge in funding partnerships and take into account their capacities and needs. Donors should also consider flexible funding models that can be adjusted to changing circumstances. Donors should consider longer-term funding that will cover at least 3 to 5 year programs, and they should consider funding for standalone advocacy programs, because again, I think our earlier discussion showed the value of advocacy, particularly for bringing about systemic change, cannot be underestimated. Another recommendation was that donors should provide funding that will enable CSOs to innovate and experiment, and where greater flexibility would apply to the outcomes expected. Next slide, please. So just I thought I'd finish by mentioning today a particular initiative that FORUS is involved in. It's one where we're really looking at the future of civil society funding linked to the 2030 agenda, which many of you will be familiar with. So this initiative that FORUS has developed is called the FORUS Global Initiative. It's really a blueprint for strengthening and investing in civil society to ensure its effective contribution to the successful implementation of the 2030 agenda. And what we have tried to do is to look at operationalizing key provisions of the 2030 agenda linked to financing for development for civil society. And that particularly is goal or SDG 17 of the 2030 agenda. So really our work on the global initiative has and our advocacy around operationalizing funding for civil society is based on, and this is what the 2030 agenda recognizes, that civil society is a global public good and therefore deserves public support and resourcing. And we believe that what we're proposing in terms of the global initiative would increase civil society's access to sustainable and predictable financial resources through going beyond a short-term project-based approach to funding the sector and to providing core and structural funding to CSOs, while also allowing for experimentation and innovation. Next slide, please. So we argue that this could be achieved through the design of a permanent global mechanism linked to the Agenda 2030, with an annual budget from which relevant funding streams can be drawn down to support the full operationalization of all aspects of civil society's engagement with the Agenda 2030. That is implementation, advocacy, monitoring and review, innovation, and so on. We believe this global funding mechanism should recognise and respond to the diverse needs and contexts of civil society organisations globally, and the need to enhance the ability of civil society around the world to make an effective contribution to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, with a particular focus on small grassroots CSOs and those operating in difficult contexts. Next slide, please. So the governance of this mechanism, we believe, should be composed of civil society representatives from different regions of the world and from different levels, that is global, regional, national and subnational. And we believe that other relevant stakeholders should also be included. That could include governments, international institutions, private philanthropic organisations, civil society, the private sector, academia and others. That is the end of my presentation for today, but I'd be very happy to take any questions afterwards. So thank you for listening to me. And I think you can see my contact details there if you wish to contact me after the webinar today for any reason. Thank you very much for listening.
Many, many thanks, Deirdre. Just before we turn to Kenneth, can I ask you very, very briefly, could you just give your own quick assessment of the National Health Advocacy Fund? Where do you see its strengths and weaknesses in relation to the experience that you outlined from FORUS?
Yeah, so I suppose, you know, FORUS doesn't work specifically on the area of health, so I was reluctant maybe to wade in where I feel others have greater expertise. But I think a lot of the principles that have been outlined, particularly here today in the presentations that I've heard and what I've read about the National Health Advocacy Fund, are very important ones, and they echo what we have found, what FORUS has found in its own findings. Again, the involvement of local communities, the co-creation of the grant and funds that are made available, all of these things, you know, allowing for greater flexibility, for longer term planning, so that the funding cycles wouldn't be so short. You know, very often what we see are 2- and 3-year project-based approaches to delivering what are often, you know, initiatives or programs that should be much longer term in focus and require the kind of security of funding. So just to say that some of the thinking that you're doing on the National Health Advocacy Fund is very promising, and I think if those principles are fully adhered to when the fund is being you know, realised and structured, then I think that you will be successful and it'll be effective in its aims.
Thanks very much, Deirdre. That's fantastic. Let's turn now to Kenneth MWEHONGE. And for those who do not already know Kenneth, he's the program manager for the health policy advocacy at the Coalition for Health Promotion and Social Development in Uganda. That's HEPS Uganda, as you see on the screen. He brings 10 years of experience in health promotion and advocacy, and he's recognized among leading civil society advocates, both in HIV as well as the broader health sector in Uganda. So he'll talk about his own experiences in national level health advocacy based in Uganda and from his knowledge of work across East Africa. Kenneth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for the kind introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on this call today. Like introduced, I'm Kenneth, and I'm here to share with you the country-specific national level advocacy funding. As mentioned, actually my experience is 12 years in this at country level. What I'm going to share, sorry, I don't have slides, but what I'm going to share is not very different from what Deirdre has just presented from the Global North. It's interesting to see that we share the same experiences at one of the least developed countries we have that I live in, But at country level, we've had several funding for advocacy. We've had funding from global networks, global basket networks. We have funding from the local networks here and local networks in my country. We have funding from developed countries like the USAID. We have funding from the Dutch government, DFID, to mention but a few. And also we have funding from philanthropists globally, and these who offer direct funding to civil society here in Uganda. And I've implemented several grants funded by different donors that I've mentioned up there. And the experience that I've had with these grants and with this funding is that one is that they are prescriptive. DEIRDRE has mentioned this, and these funds come with conditions. They have already predetermined purpose or priority, and this makes it difficult to sometimes use this funding to do advocacy work for issues that really affect us here as Ugandans. A point in case, we have several legal or policy issues. The environment that we operate in is kind of restrictive. And for example, in the health sector, our constitution alone has no express provision for the right to health. And that has caused fundamental challenges in terms of realizing the right to health in Uganda. But all my life in civil society, we've struggled to get funding to address this issue because one, it's difficult to determine when you can change a constitution. It's not something that is changed daily. There are periods in which the constitution is changed, but no one is willing to fund you for the pre-work that involves engaging different stakeholders to change this. And it has affected a lot of our advocacy work, and yet this is not a priority for many donors. And then again, this was mentioned by one of the presenters, I forget, that is that this funding usually is not focused on strengthening our systems as local civil society here. It's just of late that some of this funding, and also it's because that they strengthen our systems, also to strengthen their local programs here, that we've had this organizational capacity development by, for example, USAID, but also it strengthened their programs that they have in country here. That's why they strengthen organizations like us, and also their focus changing now to more local organizations. That's when they realize that, well, we've been working with these CSOs, but they don't have stronger systems and can't sustain themselves. And for all those years, they haven't been focused on sustainability of focused interventions for local CSOs. And again, this funding for advocacy has almost all the projects I've worked on. The longest has been 4 years, but they usually, the time for advocacy projects has been really, really short. And it's very difficult to achieve results in such a short time for advocacy. Advocacy is not linear. Sometimes what we preconceive or the hypothesis we have of achieving or changing something takes longer than expected. For example, last week we had a victory for that we achieved after 9 years. If you've heard of the maternal health petition in Uganda, popularly known as Petition 16, it took us 9 years to influence our government. We took government to court, but taken them 9 years to acknowledge that maternal health is a constitutional right. And there've been many donors that have come and left to support this initiative, but we kept mobilizing local resources to push it. And this tells you how challenging it is to fund, to get funding for advocacy. Then it's also limited, like DEIRDRE has mentioned, there are not many donors that are there to fund advocacy. And again, it's not flexible. Like I said, it's very prescriptive. Sometimes, like I mentioned, advocacy is not linear, and they've not done the research, like DEIRDRE has mentioned, to tailor these funding to the needs of the local issues. Then we find it difficult to use because of those conditions. Also, you find that it's not tailored. But in 2012, there was an initiative that's very related to this new initiative that Alan and team are leading, and I was very excited to learn about it. There was the International Health Partnerships, which had the Civil Society Fund between 2012 and 2016. And the approach of this fund was a little different because it was more of a bottom-up approach. It was a basket fund hosted by the International Health Partnership, which was hosted by the WHO. And locally, at the global level, the Global North, it was hosted by the managed by Oxfam GB and Oxfam German. And it's one of the findings that was tailored to the local needs of civil society. And for example, Uganda, we use those resources to influence our intellectual property policy framework. We influenced our Industrial Property Act to incorporate TRIPS flexibilities to enable production of local generic medicines, of which 90% of Ugandans depend on. It also helped us influence or put in place a mechanism in which government officially a platform that facilitates community participation in health service delivery. And these were our own ideas, and the funding was coming in to fund our ideas and the things that we need. And I'm glad that there is such an initiative happening. It's something that it's very, very exciting because this funding was flexible. The tactics we planned, whenever we realized that they are not working, they were very flexible with us to change them. And it built a capacity of civil society. Those advocates are still here. And well, that's part of the experience of the funding that I have from Uganda. So I'll be happy to take any questions, but in a nutshell, hope I was able to share my experience and the experience from Uganda. Thank you. Over to you, Ravi.
Many, many thanks, Kenneth. That's fantastic to hear about the national level experience. That's a very rich experience, adding a lot of substance to what DEIRDRE had talked about as well. We'll turn now to an open discussion. And as part of that discussion, let's not conceive of it as a question and answer to the speakers. Let's think about our own experiences, what we can add. The speakers have introduced a lot of interesting topics. Let's see how we might be able to interrogate that. And remember, as much as we may be interested in a National Health Advocacy Fund, it does not yet exist. So this is a chance not to access funding, not to be part of a network, but to contribute to an idea, a concept that's under development. It's a work in progress. So let's take that point, and let's also consider how we might critique this aspect. What does it mean for an alternative way of conducting development assistance for health? Are we moving beyond aid, or are we just adding another funding mechanism within the existing aid paradigm? Like to go over to a lot of people and also just highlight that David Barr, who's also working with the group that Alan and Angela are a part of, the National Health Advocacy Fund Partnership, he's put his email into the chat box. He's very keen to hear stories directly from you. So feel free to introduce some ideas now. Let's have a debate, and then also share with David later on the email. So at this point, let's hear from various people. I know we had a few points that came up in the question answers already. Spero, if I can ask you to pick on the first 1, 2, or 3 individuals who are raising hands or putting ideas into the chat box.
Thank you, Ravi. First, so far we don't really not. We have some questions. If someone would like to speak, you just raise your hand, and you will be unmuted. So I cannot see someone who has raised his hand yet, but I have some, maybe give the floor to for some question to
Dennis would be there.
Driende. How, we said, Antonia is asking a question. How would the academia be involved in this initiative of advocacy on the future of civil society organization funding? This question is for Driende. If you can reply to that question.
The question is for me, is it?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, you know, I suppose we think the role of academia can't be underestimated either in terms of designing new funding paradigms, because, you know, certain academics are very involved in carrying out health research and also in looking at, I mean, I think, again, we need to make more of an empirical case, so basically evidence-based case for changing the kind of funding paradigms that are in place at the moment. And I think with sort of, you know, the support from academia, we can actually ensure that these kind of studies are commissioned. And so, for example, FORUS works closely with a department in the University of Wolverhampton in the United Kingdom, and they are, a lot of their researchers are from the Global South, and they do a lot of research in the Global South, bringing the voices from the Global South and allowing those to sort of shape the kind of research findings that they're making. So I think the role of academia could be very helpful indeed, both in terms of tapping into different constituencies, different voices, maybe more local and community-based voices from the Global South as well as the Global North, but also helping to provide, evidence base for the need to change our funding paradigms. And, you know, this is a very promising new Health Advocacy Fund that we're talking about here today, and the kind of consultation that you're doing here, you know, I think we need to look at processes whereby we can, I mean, if we're encouraging donors to think more flexibly about co-creating funding, you know, grants and so on, and funding partnerships with local communities and other stakeholders, we need to do some research into, well, where have those been tried out? You know, what have been the successes and the failures and so on. So again, the role of academia, I think, in all of this could be very important.
Thank you very much, Driende. We will be handing over to, we give the floor to Dennis Bukenya, and then to Peter Owiti. So first, Dennis, you have the floor. Thomas will unmute you, then you can ask your question directly to the speakers.
Thank you, Spero. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. Go ahead.
Okay. Mine is not a question per se,
okay,
but it is some kind of contribution, probably it may be taken into consideration as the partnership is in the making. In my years of experience in advocacy, I have noted that most of the funders have a bit of a funding curve. And you find that we who are working in communities sometimes would want to structure the kind of approach that we have in the communities in such a way that it gains impact and benefits the people that we are trying to represent. But then because of the kind of specific funding that the donor has given, and the fear that tomorrow you will not be able to have funding from this donor, you kind of work towards achieving what the donor wants. So I'm just probably raising a concern that it may be important that the way we structure this is to react to community research and community perspectives that probably will be able to create impact that indeed makes aid a partnership, not necessarily a token of, contributing to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for this this contribution that you made. I would like to give now the floor to Mr. Peter Owiti. Please, Mr. Owiti, you have the floor. Go ahead. We lost Peter Owiti. And I don't know if there is any reaction to what Mr. Dennis said among the speakers. If speakers have any reactions to what or any contribution or comment you might say, it is welcome.
Thank you so much. Allow me to jump in and start off by saying that I did enjoy the presentation by DEIRDRE, and it actually speaks to a number of things we've been discussing relating to what the fund should look like, how it should be structured. And so I think one thing, DEIRDRE, your presentation does is that we can build up on that and see how well we then engage with the donors around some of these inequality and power questions and representation on who makes decision on who should be funded. And I think you are quite spot on bringing this on board. And the colleague from Uganda, indeed, we have seen the important victory from SEHUD around making the right to health justiciable, meaning that now the High Court in Uganda has set out certain principles and elements that the Ministry of Health must comply with. And that again provides another example around why it's important to fund national level or grassroots organizations to be able to take this kind of advocacy forward. I'm not able to respond to all the questions, but looking at it, the whole question around how can we improve advocacy at grassroots level, how can we be able to ensure there's accountability, and from the questions Peter had raised and others, you tend to see that what the fund and what goal we're driving towards is a goal that is seeking to get resources down to those at the grassroots level, getting those at the grassroots level to advance some of the advocacy initiatives that we already see are working, and trying to get them to have the citizens hold their leaders accountable, whether you want to achieve UHC, whether you want to ensure people get access to reproductive healthcare services, beyond relying on the funding that may come from donors. There's an aspect of advocacy that requires us to be able to hold our governments accountable and our leaders accountable, and that is part of what will drive advocacy in terms of going forward. And to go specifically to Mansour's reflection around advocacy for health financing, I think what has worked in our experience, either with the Global Fund, either with funding for UHC, is around setting priorities in a transparent manner, tracking the funding of those priorities, mitigating against leakage, wastage, and corruption by promoting transparency and access to information. So I think this is an initiative that we need to keep bouncing through. I feel like we are aligned in the fact that we see the need to ensure that money does and resources trickle down to the people at the grassroots level. And I do agree with the fact that indeed academia have an important role in helping with the evaluation of grantee advocacy and also of our funding process. So I think there's a role for everyone, and we need to see how we keep the discussion going and getting more feedback. And as David said, if you have any ideas, please drop him an email and it will be included in the package that we'll be putting together to share with various donors and partners. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. We will hand over the floor to Mirja Komtupa from the Dutch.
Sorry, I got lost.
Yeah, she got lost. Mirja,
I'm here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so some reflections on the idea of the fund partnership. So I think it's very much needed, and I want to echo this also from the side of the network of civil society organizations that are doing advocacy work on the global financing facility, for example, where in discussions that we have in this network, it always comes back that CSOs at national level don't have the resources to do meaningful evidence-based advocacy towards a global health initiative that the GFF is. So it's a really established need, this fund. Another point that I wanted to make, again from my experience in advocacy work, is the importance of long-term funding, because advocacy work doesn't have rapid outcomes. It's more long-term outcomes, and it's also more tricky to measure these outcomes and to count. It's not as straightforward as service delivery. So it will be good if in the development of this fund to keep this in mind, the reporting needs that these CSOs will be asked to present. And a final point is that exactly because civic space is shrinking in many contexts, and we know it as well from country partners of ours, what happens if a national CSO find it difficult to advocate for human rights in health in their country context because of an oppressive government? Could maybe this new partnership provide some kind of support and protection to advocates for them to be able to operate? I don't know how this could be done, but it came to my mind while listening to everything. So that's from me. Thank you, and we stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Miria. And we will now give the floor to Mr. Peter Owiti for his comments or suggestion on the National Health Advocacy Fund partnership.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank everybody for your contribution to this valuable meeting. What I wanted to add has already been mentioned earlier by Miria about enabling environment for civil society to advocate for health services. Because once you start questioning the government or you start pushing the government, particularly when you are getting funds from outside the country, from international networks, then you are sometimes treated as you are against your country. So we know, like in Kenya, we have various civil society networks that are pushing for enabling environment for civil society to voice. We think that we can build that stamina and bravery like our old advocates during independence campaigns, so that we can risk our voices and our lives so that we can advocate for provision of health and seek also partnership with the government to give us enabling environment so that we work together to bring services to the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter Owiti, for making the same remarks, or making the same comment, almost the same comment with Miria. Now we will then give the floor to Akani from Nigeria to give also his comment or maybe suggestion for the National Health Advocacy Fund partnership. So Akani, you have the floor.
Okay, hi everybody. Spiro, hi.
Yeah, thank you.
My experience working in the social space for a number of years now has been the fact that the do know when there is funding and they come up with funding, the criteria that they give is not favorable to the organizations, mostly the community-based organizations at the grassroots level. And we are looking at advocacy, not a top bottom up approach, but we are looking at the bottom top approach. So I want us to just see how we can correct this approach. Whatever criteria that are given, they have to give consideration to people at the grassroots, I mean community organizations at the grassroots level that are really doing the job. And again, I also want the funders to also see a way of correcting the paradigm of nepotism, because really, you want to be sincere with ourselves, there is a lot of nepotism when it comes to the global funding, I mean global fund generally, that they know the people that are qualified, kind of. I don't know, maybe they have insiders in some of these funders organizations and they get pre-information that even the people at the grassroots level might apply for the same funding, but they are not given the funding. And you keep on seeing one organization carrying out funding year in, year out, and the rest. They now empower the people at the organization at the grassroots level to stand on their feet and become the voice that we are expecting them to become and something. So there have to be a level playing ground between established organizations and the organizations that are not established. That's just what I'm trying to say. So everyone has to rise up and see how we can correct that one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Akani Obot. And I would like to invite you to reflections, and also to let you know that as we are coming to the close and before we end, I just want to return to our brilliant speaker and ask them to share a very short 1 minute reflection on what anything that surprised them, or what is your key takeaway. Did all of these sound very familiar to you? And I would also to them to keep in mind that there is a question of creation of a platform of service providers where the service provider will feed them with challenges and experiences that was mentioned by Antonia Kamate. So please, you have the floor, and feel free to start. If someone is ready to start, you can go, please. Yes.
Well, maybe just very quickly to say, I heard a lot of things today that I found very valuable and very interesting, but perhaps the focus on advocacy is one that really interested me because I work in advocacy myself. I'm an advocacy coordinator, and this idea that, you know, the sort of timeframes, the sort of cycle where you might expect to see impact of advocacy is definitely longer term than a lot of the other, you know, impacts you might be measuring of, for example, service delivery and so on. So I think we need to put a bit of thought into that too, the best way to monitor the impact and the kind of, you know, timelines we should be looking at when we're really expecting impacts from advocacy. Because if we're talking about, as I mentioned earlier, sort of promoting systemic change through our advocacy, and particularly, you know, a rights-based approach to the delivery of services, which may not be something where you know, there may not be any tradition of that in a particular country, it does take time to achieve. And I think we need to factor that into the funding models, the advocacy funding models that we design. But thank you very much for allowing me to participate today, and I really have enjoyed it and learned a lot.
Okay, thank you so much, Joep. We were pleased to have you on board here. Before I'll give the floor to the remaining of the speakers, and I must also let you know that Angela, for other purposes, is not has already left us. So I will hand over to Ravi to give us maybe some insights before we continue.
Thank you, Sparrow. We've heard a lot of very interesting interventions, experiences, ideas. I just wanted to cover a few of the points that have come out. We heard a lot about advocacy being a non-linear approach. requires flexibility. It needs to be seen as a standalone approach and not attached to an intervention. We've heard about accountability quite a bit, both how do we hold CSOs accountable and how do CSOs hold governments accountable, and where is the community voice in all of that? There were some points that have not been fully explored yet: innovations, co-creation, involvement of grassroots. And there's also the issue of capacity building. Will the National Health Advocacy Fund be looking at capacity building for national level or even local level advocacy organizations? And some points about governance also came out. So as we're wrapping up, I just listed off a few points that I found very interesting, but maybe we can hear some reflections that also capture some of these points, because we want this to be a constructive, critical, but constructive contribution to the development of a national health advocacy fund. So Spiro, as we go back to the panelists and the speakers, can we maybe address a few of these points as well in our closing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ravi, for that. And I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Alan Malache, as for his maybe his takeaway, and maybe he has, as we are coming to the close of this webinar, what is his takeaway? Is there anything that has surprised him? And did all these interventions sound to him very familiar? And in 1 minute reflection, what is on what he has today? What is his take? Mr. Nalan, please.
Thank you so much, Sepro. Yes, indeed, the conversation has been very enlightening. Let me start off by trying to address a few of the issues that Ravi has mentioned. I think for me, one of my take-home message and what we're seeking this fund to drive is that the overall governance of any funding mechanism should jointly and equally be shared by civil society and donors. And that for me is my big take-home message here. And also that an advocacy funding mechanism should be flexible based on needs and content. We should not have one-size-fits-all structure. And I think for me, the advocacy needs should be tailor-made to those who are working on the issues, and that is part of that conversation. I still think, and one message I'm taking away from here is around the importance of collaboration and coordination across the broader health and development sphere. So I think we need to break down HIV, TB, and human rights silos, for examples, or NCD silos or mental health silos, to be able to work together. Definitely capacity building is important, and linking with those who do service delivery to see what are the issues that need to be advocated for is something that comes through. Overall, I'll just say that efficiency and quality to ensure that we have increased money towards advocacy and not money being taken away from another docket is pretty important. So we need to find a way to ensure that the right things, the right groups are funded so that we can be able to get the right results. This is very critical to reaching those who are vulnerable and left behind, and those who are the grassroots method. So for me, that's the message that I take home from here, but really appreciative of the fact that there are people interested in these processes. There are people interested to see funding going to a grassroots level, and they're interested in seeing that this change happens at that level. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's been a great conversation, and we keep going at it. Asante.
Thank you, Mr. Alan Malache, for your contribution too. And now we're going to hand over to Mr. Kenneth, as we wanted him also to have his say regarding his granting perspectives, because he has a lot of experience in advocacy works. So, Mr. Kenneth, please, you have your say.
Thank you so much, Spiro, and everyone. This has been a very exciting conversation and educative for me, also learning from DEIRDRE's experience from Global North. And that just emphasizes my take home. We need bottom-up funding mechanisms where the community leads the priority setting of which this funding should priorities of what these fundings should go to. And the National Health Advocacy Fund is one of those initiatives, and I'm very excited about it to learn that it's underway. And I think that we should all support that, because we've seen when we have a bottom-up mechanism, the successes are easier to achieve. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kenneth, for your contribution. Now we're moving on to the next steps, and for the National Health Advocacy Fund partnership, if there is any contribution, we would like to welcome members of from National Health Advocacy Fund. So we give them the floor, maybe to Mr. David Barr, because so far he did not yet speak. So what are the next steps for the National Health Advocacy Fund, and what are your comments regarding all this webinar that is coming to the end now?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks to everybody for such a really good conversation today. In terms of next steps, I've posted my email address. If people just send me their contact information, I will add you to our list where you'll get regularly updated information and requests to participate in the process in as many different ways as we can come up with. Our primary outreach to donors will begin at the end of this month. As Alan said, we have a co-chair in our process who's Mara Esveld from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she's going to be very active in helping us reach out to donors. As was said previously, our goal is to get donors and civil society to a table to discuss the value of health advocacy, particularly at national and local levels, and talk about the need for a funding stream and what the values of that process and how we can put it together. So once we start doing the donor outreach, we're just waiting for people to get back from holidays and stuff. Then we will hold our first joint meeting with our civil society steering committee and the group of donors that have agreed to participate. I will be keeping everybody up to date through our list, and we'll be putting out a series of documents to support our work, including a compilation of advocacy activities that are going on at national level. So if you send me examples of advocacy work that you are engaged in, I will include that in our compilation. We're trying to get as many different examples as we possibly can. Happy to take any other questions.
Thank you so many thanks to you, Mr. David Barr, for your contribution. So we are very coming to the end of this webinar, and if you wanted to get you are an organization interested in using in transforming health aid, consider signing with Kampala Declaration and joining Beyond Aid email group. The information is on the link that is above on the slide. So please sign the Kampala Declaration, and then you'll be part of us. You can be part of us as individual or as an organization. So as we are coming to the end, I will hand over now to the host of this webinar, Mr. Thomas Schwartz, to conclude. Thank you. Thomas, over to you.
Well, I'm happy that I'm not the host, but that this meeting has been co-hosted by your team. And I am really happy to be part of the team. So also thanks to Spiro and Ravi and Tess and all the others. Just an outlook, we will have a next webinar in October. I cannot yet indicate a date because this date is being still under negotiation. A task group of the Kampala Initiative called Watch the Gap has just published a report on this global action plan for healthy lives and well-being for all. We call it a critical civil society perspective on the development, potential impact, and implementation of this plan, which has been developed by 13 of the most powerful international actors and donors in the field of health, and launched a year ago in New York as at a side event of the UN General Assembly. So we wanted to launch our report on the gap, and we have been in touch with the WHO Secretariat of this Global Action Plan, and we agreed that we postpone our webinar until they have published a report on the initial implementation of this action plan. So it might be early October, it might be mid-October, but please, if you are on our mailing list, then you will be informed. Or Miria has just published the link to our task group, Watch the Gap, in the chat. Or get back to Miria or Michael Semakula or myself or other colleagues to learn more about this initiative and this publication and the upcoming webinar. And yes, so if Spiro asked me to close, let me close by thanking everybody. Stay in touch if you want to get involved in this non-organization, but in this civil society space for discussing and debating and hopefully promoting aid and cooperation to a next level. See you next time, and goodbye. The chat will be open for a while, and you will get a follow-up message afterwards, also tomorrow or next week by email, all those who have participated. Have a good day, have a good evening, have a good morning, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for this very good initiative. We hope for the best.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.